If this text lands in his hands, I'm done. I whispered it under my breath, heart hammering like it was trying to escape my chest. My thumb hovered over the send button on my phone, a tiny slip away from absolute disaster. I had meant it for Derek, my ex who had left more scars than memories, but somehow, in my exhausted haze after a 12-hour shift, my fingers had betrayed me. The screen flashed back the words in bold letters, FCKU. And above it, in bold unknown to me, Richard Blackwood's name glared like a spotlight on every mistake I'd ever made. I froze, staring at the ceiling of my tiny Manhattan apartment, the hum of the refrigerator and the distant wail of sirens the only soundtrack to the panic blooming in my chest. Every logical thought screamed at me to delete the message, to pretend this never happened, but the send button had been pressed, and the damage, whatever it would be, was done. My hands shook as I set the phone down, the vibrating screen mocking me with every pulse. Minutes passed like hours, each second stretching thinner than the last, until a sharp knock on my door made me leap as if the building itself had shoved me. I tiptoed to the peephole, my breath caught in my throat. There he was. Richard Blackwood. 65, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, his silver hair perfectly in place despite the drizzle outside. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply stood there, ice-piercing, cold blue that could freeze the air between us. I wanted to tell myself it was coincidence, that perhaps he was someone else entirely, but every fiber of my being recognized the aura before the face. Power. Authority. Absolute control. I stepped back instinctively, my knees weak, the thin thread of confidence I had been clinging to unraveling instantly. My living room felt suddenly inadequate, the peeling wallpaper and mismatched furniture unable to contain the intensity radiating off him. He raised a single hand, palm open in a gesture that was as commanding as it was non-threatening, and spoke in a voice low and smooth, each syllable measured and deliberate. You know what this message means, don't you, Emily? My stomach dropped. I had no reply. Words, the thing I usually wielded as a shield, failed me. The knock on my apartment had shifted everything in a heartbeat. Every plan I had made, every calculated move to rebuild my life after Derek, suddenly seemed laughably irrelevant. He stepped forward, and I could hear the faint click of his leather shoes on the hardwood, a rhythm that echoed through the tiny space, each step a drumbeat marking the arrival of inevitability. I could smell the faint trace of expensive cologne mixed with rain, a scent that somehow grounded and terrified me at the same time. My phone vibrated again in my pocket. Derek, I assumed. But when I glanced down, the screen illuminated Richard Blackwood's initials. The implications crashed over me like the waves I had once watched on a summer trip, wild, uncontrollable, and certain. I backed into the corner near the couch, pressing myself as flat as I could, heart racing in erratic bursts. He didn't move aggressively, didn't reach out, yet every fiber of the room seemed tuned to his presence alone. He stopped just short of my coffee table, hands folded lightly behind his back, surveying the small apartment like a general assessing the front lines. And then, as if to remind me that my fate had shifted with a single accidental message, he smiled just slightly, the corners of his mouth lifting in a way that suggested amusement and calculated interest rather than warmth. This is how our story begins, he said, voice carrying the weight of inevitability. I swallowed hard, nodding, though my lips were dry and useless, and the room seemed to hold its breath along with me. The rain tapped persistently against the window, punctuating the tension like a metronome, each drop a reminder that nothing would ever be the same again. My thoughts raced, a jumble of panic, curiosity, and a reluctant recognition that a life-altering encounter had just arrived at my door. The apartment felt impossibly small now, every object and shadow seeming to stretch and loom in the intensity of Richard Blackwood's presence. I could feel his gaze like a weight pressing against my chest, precise, unyielding, yet not threatening. He did not ask me to sit, nor did he gesture toward the couch, but I found myself perching there instinctively, legs tucked under, eyes fixed on the polished shoes that had stopped just a few feet away. He moved with the measured ease of someone used to command, each subtle motion exuding control that made my own movements feel clumsy and hesitant. The rain outside continued its rhythmic assault on the windows, and I noticed how each droplet seemed to punctuate the silence between us. My hands twitched in my lap, fingers fidgeting with the edge of my sweater, and he watched with an unspoken patience that somehow deepened the tension. "Do you understand the gravity of a message like that?" he asked finally, voice low, resonant, deliberate. I swallowed, unable to speak, but the words settled in the room, heavy and inescapable. I nodded minutely, aware that nodding was the only response I could muster without shattering into stammered words. He stepped closer, the soft click of his heels on the hardwood echoing against the walls, and I caught the faint scent of his cologne mingling with the rain, a subtle, grounding detail amidst the storm of panic in my chest. He did not touch me, yet the proximity alone carried weight, a silent assertion that I was now within his orbit, an orbit I could neither predict nor escape. My mind raced, calculating exits, rehearsing apologies, but each potential path dissolved under the clarity of his presence. He spoke again, softer this time. I am not here to punish. I am here because choices like that have consequences, and consequences must be acknowledged. The words, measured and composed, created a strange paradox. The statement was firm, yet it offered a thread of understanding I had not anticipated. I shifted slightly, the floorboards creaking beneath me, a subtle betrayal of my nervousness, and he tilted his head ever so slightly, recognizing, without comment, the tremor of my body. Time seemed to stretch in the pause that followed, each second a lens focusing on the fine details, the precise crease of his suit, the deliberate calm in his posture, the rain blurring the city lights outside into a watercolor haze. I realized that in all the chaos of my life, in the relentless hum of deadlines, mistakes, and long hours, nothing had ever commanded my attention with such absolute focus. He finally allowed a pause, his eyes sweeping across the room, absorbing everything, assessing, yet giving nothing away. I breathed, a shallow, conscious effort, and felt the first hint of understanding. This encounter was not a momentary upset, not a fleeting shock. It was the beginning of a story that would unfold far beyond this tiny apartment, far beyond any plan I had ever made. And as the rain pelted the windows with relentless insistence, I understood, with a visceral certainty, that my life, my carefully ordered routines, and my understanding of control had irrevocably changed. Richard Blackwood remained standing, quiet, observing, a silent conductor orchestrating the tempo of this unanticipated symphony, and I, perched on the edge of my couch, could only watch, caught between fear, fascination, and the sharp, undeniable edge of curiosity. The air in my apartment seemed heavier now, every sound amplified, the rain tapping against the windows like a percussion track to my racing thoughts. Richard Blackwood had not moved since his declaration, yet his presence had filled the room to its corners, stretching beyond the confines of the furniture and walls. I shifted slightly, careful to make no sudden movements, and he followed the subtle cues, a tilt of his head, a narrowing of his eyes, as if he could read my pulse without touching me. My mind raced, piecing together what had led me here, the accumulation of long shifts, sleepless nights, and careless mistakes, all culminating in a single, accidental message that had summoned this man to my doorstep. The clock ticked relentlessly on the wall, each second a reminder that time was passing, that every choice I had made had consequences I had not yet fully grasped. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice smooth, low, carrying the weight of authority that had me sitting straighter despite the anxiety coiling in my chest. "Emily, do you see the reach of a single decision?" he asked, pacing slowly along the edge of the room, hands clasped lightly behind his back. His tone was calm. Yet the precision of it demanded attention, a subtle command that made my own breath catch involuntarily. I nodded, the only motion I could manage, feeling the weight of his scrutiny settle over me like a tangible force. The apartment, cluttered with the remnants of my day-to-day life, felt suddenly inadequate, a stage far too small for the gravity of our interaction. I could smell the faint mix of rain, polished leather, and something faintly spicy that clung to him, an invisible marker of his presence that made the mundane seem extraordinary. He stopped near the window, gazing out at the city lights shimmering through the rain-soaked streets, and I realized he was not merely observing me, he was assessing, calculating, measuring the scope of our unplanned collision of worlds. I shifted again, legs tensed beneath me, hands gripping the edge of the couch, and he turned his gaze back toward me, piercing and unwavering. "I do not act impulsively," he said, his voice low, carrying both reassurance and an unspoken warning. "Every step is deliberate. Every encounter, measured. You will learn that actions, even accidental ones, have weight." The clarity of his words struck me, a lesson delivered without aggression, without intimidation, yet with a force that made me acutely aware of my own vulnerability. My mind reeled, thinking of all the mundane choices I had made that day, each seemingly insignificant, now illuminated under the lens of consequence and control. Outside, the rain softened to a steady drizzle, and the city continued its endless hum, oblivious to the quiet, seismic shift taking place in this small apartment. I breathed slowly, deliberately, forcing my mind to focus on the present, on the reality that I could not retreat, that I was entwined in this unexpected narrative. Richard Blackwood's eyes did not soften, did not falter, they held steady, unwavering, compelling me to acknowledge a truth I had not anticipated. My life had pivoted on a single moment, and from this point forward, the trajectory was altered irreversibly. I realized that understanding and fear could coexist, that fascination could emerge from tension, and that in the controlled space of his presence, I was witnessing the unfolding of something far larger than myself, a lesson in consequence, authority, and the inescapable weight of an accidental choice. Each tick of the clock echoed against my heartbeat, a cadence of inevitability, and I knew with a strange, sharp clarity that nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The apartment grew quieter, the rain outside thinning into a gentle mist, each drop tapping a soft rhythm against the windowpane. I remained perched on the edge of the couch, my fingers gripping the fabric, mind spinning with thoughts that refused to settle. Richard Blackwood stood near the window, the faint glow of the city reflecting in his eyes, giving them a calm, almost calculating glimmer. He did not speak immediately, but I could feel the weight of his presence pressing into every corner of the room. Each breath he took measured, deliberate, commanding without raising a hand. My phone buzzed again on the coffee table, a reminder that the world outside my apartment continued, unaware of the tension and quiet authority within. I glanced at it, instinctively hoping it was Derek, perhaps a chance to reclaim a fragment of normalcy, but it was not. It was a notification, a mundane message, yet in this moment, even ordinary things seemed strange, almost out of place against the backdrop of the aura filling the room. Richard finally turned his gaze toward me, and I felt a sharp intake of air escape my lips despite myself. His eyes held a clarity that was unsettling, the kind that seemed to penetrate beyond appearances into the essence of intention. "Emily," he said, voice steady, carrying a calm authority that made me sit straighter, "the choice you made in a moment of frustration has consequences far beyond what you anticipated. It brought us together, but it also brought clarity. You will learn to navigate that clarity." The word struck me, not as a threat, but as a promise, a challenge wrapped in calm certainty. I nodded, feeling the tightness in my chest loosen slightly, though the pulse of tension remained. He stepped closer, the faint scent of his cologne mixing with the lingering smell of rain on the hardwood floors, grounding the room in an almost surreal clarity. "We will start with understanding," he continued, each word deliberate, measured, as if teaching a lesson without raising his voice, not with fear, not with resentment, but with presence. "You must observe, learn, and act with awareness." I felt my mind trying to catch up, my thoughts scrambling to anticipate his intent, yet I realized quickly that anticipation was futile. His control over the space, over the dynamic between us, was absolute. Outside, the city hummed on, lights flickering against wet asphalt, oblivious to the quiet revolution happening in this small apartment. I felt my shoulders relax fractionally, realizing that although I was unprepared, I was present, and presence was what he valued, what he demanded. He moved to the couch beside me, close enough to feel the warmth of his movement but without invading my space, and I noticed a subtle shift in the room, a momentary softness amidst the weight of authority. "This is the beginning," he said, gaze steady, unwavering, "and in beginnings, the potential is infinite. You will see paths you never anticipated, and you will act with knowledge, not impulse. Do you understand?" I nodded, swallowing hard, each breath deliberate, feeling the gravity and opportunity intertwined in his calm declaration. The rain continued its soft rhythm against the glass, a quiet underscore to the presence and attention that now defined the space, a reminder that in the stillness of observation and measured action, a life could change irreversibly in a single evening. The night deepened around us, the city lights casting a soft glow through the rain-streaked windows, illuminating the subtle contours of the room and highlighting the contrast between the mundane and the extraordinary. I sat rigidly on the couch, my fingers twisting in my lap, the quiet hum of the refrigerator a grounding point amidst the intensity of the presence across from me. Richard Blackwood moved with deliberate care, each step measured, the soft echo of his shoes against the hardwood an almost hypnotic accompaniment to his words. "Observation is key," he said, voice low and deliberate, carrying authority. "Without aggression, not everything is as it seems, and not every choice is obvious in consequence. You must learn to see the layers beneath." I nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of his statement, realizing that every detail of my life, every action, every interaction had become part of a larger narrative I had not anticipated. Outside, the rain continued, soft and steady, a metronome to the thoughts racing in my mind, each drop marking a beat of awareness that I could not ignore. He gestured toward the small desk in the corner, where papers and files lay scattered from my day, and I noticed how effortlessly his eyes seemed to take in the room, reading it like a map, understanding its every corner and nuance. Start with awareness, he continued, pacing lightly near the window, hands clasped behind his back. Watch, listen, and learn the rhythms of those around you. Influence is subtle, and understanding precedes action. I felt a strange clarity in his words, a lesson delivered without confrontation, yet charged with purpose. My mind traced every scenario I could imagine, trying to anticipate what he expected, and yet each thought seemed to falter under the weight of his calm precision. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the room, then settled back on me, intense and unwavering. You will make mistakes, he said, a hint of softness threading through the authority, but each error is an opportunity to understand more, to refine your perception. You are here because you were ready to see, not because you were told to act. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension in my shoulders ease fractionally, and realized that his presence demanded focus, a mindfulness that I had rarely applied to any aspect of my life. He stepped closer, but maintained respectful distance, and I noticed the faint fragrance of rain-soaked leather mixed with subtle notes of cedar, a sensory anchor that made the room feel grounded, yet charged with potential. Tomorrow, he said finally, voice steady and deliberate, you will begin observing your environment differently. Small details will matter, decisions will carry more weight, and every interaction will offer insight if you choose to perceive it. This is not about fear. It is about presence, comprehension, and readiness. I nodded, committing the words to memory, feeling the gravity of the moment, aware that the ordinary patterns of my life had shifted irrevocably. The rain softened further, the gentle patter a quiet companion to the silent understanding that had settled between us, and I realized, with a careful, measured thought, that the first steps of a profound change were already underway, subtle yet undeniable, marking the beginning of a journey in which observation, awareness, and deliberate action would shape the trajectory of everything I had once considered predictable. The soft glow of the city filtered through the rain-speckled windows, painting the apartment in muted tones of amber and gray, each beam catching dust particles that danced lazily in the still air. I sat on the edge of the couch, notebook balanced on my knees, trying to capture the mental notes that had been swirling since the moment Richard Blackwood had arrived, each observation a fragment of the lesson he had imposed without speaking a word. He stood by the window again, arms folded lightly across his chest, surveying the skyline with a detached intensity that made the space feel simultaneously constricted and infinite. The room seemed to vibrate subtly with his presence, a silent pulse that I could not ignore, each inhalation and exhalation of mine measured against the rhythm of his calm breathing. Focus on the details that are often overlooked, he said, voice low, almost conversational but carrying the undeniable weight of expectation. The small indicators reveal far more than what is obvious. Perception precedes judgment, and judgment without perception is a weakness. I nodded slowly, absorbing the cadence of his words, feeling the shift from fear to the prickling awareness that he was not merely instructing me but guiding my understanding of a world I had never consciously inhabited. The notebook in my hands felt suddenly inadequate to capture the precision he demanded, yet I wrote, lines and observations forming a latticework of insight I hoped would honor the depth of the lesson. Rain continued to patter against the glass in a gentle, persistent rhythm, each droplet punctuating the silence like a subtle metronome, and I realized that even in this quiet, ordinary apartment, extraordinary observation was possible, and influence, when exercised with awareness, was powerful beyond measure. Richard moved slightly, his silhouette cutting a clean line against the window, and I became acutely conscious of how presence could command a space without words, a lesson unfolding as I watched him, every subtle motion, every measured pause, imparting instruction without overt demonstration. I adjusted the notebook, jotting mental cues, learning to recognize the nuances of posture, the weight of intent behind a gaze, the language of subtle movements, each element a piece of a puzzle that he had brought into sharp relief. Do not rush your conclusions, he added, voice steady, each word deliberate, allow the situation to present itself fully. Actions will follow clarity, and clarity cannot be forced. I inhaled slowly, feeling the depth of the statement resonate within me, the room, the rain, and the city beyond all coalescing into a quiet affirmation of observation and patience. He stepped away from the window, moving toward the center of the room, not closing distance aggressively but asserting a presence that demanded acknowledgement, and I understood fully that mastery of perception was as much about restraint as it was about attention. The gentle ticking of a clock seemed amplified in the space between us, a metronome marking the passage of time, and a lesson that felt both subtle and infinite, and I realized that the initial chaos, the accidental message, had been transformed into an opportunity, a deliberate unfolding of awareness, patience, and measured engagement that I had never before experienced. Each second in the room carried weight, and I felt myself absorbing it, recognizing that the first step in understanding Richard Blackwood, and the unforeseen journey he had brought into my life, required patience, meticulous attention, and the quiet acceptance of a world I had yet to navigate fully. The city outside had quieted to a soft drizzle, the neon reflections in the puddles forming abstract patterns across the wet sidewalks, and inside, the apartment felt suspended in time, a space removed from ordinary life. I leaned back slightly on the couch, notebook closed now, my hands resting lightly on my knees, absorbing the lessons that had been imparted through presence rather than instruction. Richard Blackwood stood near the window once more, gaze sweeping over the apartment as though seeing not only the room but the potential for the choices that would unfold within it. He did not speak immediately, allowing the silence to stretch, a deliberate pause that made every subtle movement, every heartbeat, feel magnified. Finally, he turned his attention fully toward me, eyes steady, unflinching, carrying both expectation and subtle patience. "Emily," he said, voice smooth and measured, "understanding comes not only from observation but from recognition of how one's own actions intersect with the intentions of others. Influence is exercised carefully, and awareness precedes control." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words settle over me, each syllable registering with a clarity that left little room for distraction. The rain outside provided a gentle percussion, each drop against the window a reminder of the persistence and inevitability of time, a rhythm that contrasted with the stillness of the room yet harmonized with the lesson being imparted. I could feel the shift within myself, the transition from apprehension to a tentative comprehension that my actions, even accidental ones, carried significance far beyond immediate perception. Richard moved slightly closer, though not intrusively, maintaining a measured distance that reinforced the gravity of his presence without overwhelming the space. I became aware of the faint scent of his cologne, a subtle mixture of cedar and rain-soaked leather, grounding me amidst the heightened awareness he demanded. "Mistakes are inevitable," he continued, voice deliberate, each word precise, "but reflection transforms them into understanding. Every interaction, every choice, even unintentional, is an opportunity to observe the underlying structure of intention." I exhaled slowly, letting the words sink in, realizing that this was not a lesson in compliance but in perception, a careful teaching of how attentiveness and measured reaction could alter outcomes in ways I had never considered. He gestured toward the city skyline, the lights shimmering through the rain like distant stars, and added, "The world outside is complex, layered, and continuous. Your role within it begins with seeing clearly, not reacting impulsively. Presence, awareness, and careful engagement will guide you more than haste ever could." I absorbed this, feeling the pulse of the apartment, the quiet rhythm of the rain, and the measured authority emanating from him, recognizing that this evening had shifted the boundaries of my understanding, that the accidental message had opened a door into a space defined by clarity, patience, and subtle power. Each detail in the room, from the pattern of shadows to the faint reflections on the hardwood floor, became imbued with meaning, and I realized that navigating this world required attentiveness, focus, and a willingness to learn from every observation. Richard Blackwood remained poised, a figure of composed authority, and I understood that our encounter was less about confrontation than about initiation into an awareness I had not known I possessed, a careful unfolding of perception that would guide the path forward with deliberate, measured impact. The soft hum of the city at night seemed distant, muted by the layers of glass and concrete that enclosed the apartment, and yet the world beyond continued, each car passing, each faint siren adding a subtle rhythm to the evening. I remained seated on the couch, hands folded in my lap, mind working through the delicate balance of apprehension and comprehension that had been building since the accidental message. Richard Blackwood moved toward the kitchen area, gliding with a precise, quiet confidence, opening the cabinet to retrieve a glass and filling it with water, his movements deliberate and measured, emphasizing a control that extended beyond the obvious. He turned slightly, gaze catching mine, and in that moment I understood that the lessons of observation and awareness were not abstract, they were living, breathing, and intertwined with every action in the space. "Emily," he said, voice low and steady, carrying authority tempered with a rare warmth, "control is not about force, it is about understanding the environment and yourself. Awareness of details, patience in interpretation, and reflection on choices are far more powerful than immediate reaction. I nodded, absorbing the words, feeling the significance deepen with each measured breath I took, each pulse of awareness becoming more acute. The rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, each drop creating faint rivulets along the window, the sound blending with the quiet of the apartment to create a backdrop that encouraged focus and reflection. Richard took a step closer, the faint scent of cedar and leather reaching me once more, grounding the conversation in sensory detail as he continued. It is in moments of unexpected consequence, such as the one that brought us together, that one's capacity for presence is tested. You will find that clarity emerges not from haste but from attentive observation, from seeing fully before acting. I could feel the tension in my own shoulders easing, replaced by a heightened consciousness, each small detail of the apartment, the placement of furniture, the light reflecting on surfaces, becoming part of a larger tapestry I had not previously noticed. He walked toward the window again, standing tall against the soft glow of city lights, and added, "Every encounter carries lessons, and every choice, even accidental, is an opportunity to perceive the patterns that guide human behavior and influence outcomes. You will be required to notice what others overlook." I exhaled slowly, the weight of understanding settling into my mind, a quiet recognition that my life had shifted into a trajectory I could not have anticipated. Richard's presence filled the space, commanding without imposition, and I realized that the lessons were cumulative, building a foundation of awareness, patience, and measured engagement that would define the interactions yet to come. I watched him, noting the subtle cadence of his voice, the deliberate pacing of his steps, and the precision of his gestures, each one a living demonstration of the principles he described. As the rain continued its gentle accompaniment, I understood that the shift had occurred, that the accidental message had triggered a chain of events that demanded observation, thoughtfulness, and careful response, and that the next steps in this unplanned journey would require the same measured attention he had already instilled through presence, word, and example. The apartment, the rain, the quiet city beyond all seemed aligned with the gravity of the moment, and I felt, with a clarity sharpened by instruction and circumstance, that this evening had irrevocably altered my perception, my choices, and the possibilities for what was to come. The first hints of dawn crept through the blinds, softening the edges of the apartment and casting long, slender shadows across the hardwood floor. I remained on the couch, shoulders squared, notebook abandoned for the moment as I tried to reconcile the torrent of insights and revelations from the night. Richard Blackwood moved slowly through the room, each step deliberate, each motion a subtle reinforcement of the lessons he had imparted without overt instruction. The space between us felt charged, not with tension, but with a quiet understanding that this encounter had fundamentally shifted the framework of my awareness. "Emily," he said, voice calm, measured, each syllable weighted with intent, "you have begun to see the patterns, to recognize the subtle signals, and to observe the unspoken layers of circumstance. That is the first step toward influence, toward understanding the impact of choice." I nodded, feeling the clarity of the statement settle into my consciousness, the lingering apprehension from the initial accidental message giving way to a focused attentiveness. Outside, the city slowly awoke, the distant hum of traffic and the occasional honk punctuating the gentle rhythm of morning, a backdrop to the quiet intensity of the apartment. He stood near the window again, backlit by the soft, amber light, and I noticed the way his posture conveyed both authority and an almost imperceptible patience, a lesson in itself that the most powerful presence does not always demand action to command attention. "Every interaction," he continued, voice low and deliberate, "is an opportunity. Every glance, every motion, every choice contains information. You have learned to recognize that even in a space as ordinary as this apartment, there are countless cues to perceive, countless patterns to understand, and countless opportunities to act with awareness rather than reaction." I felt a shift within me, a subtle realignment of perception, the ordinary surroundings transformed into a canvas rich with detail and potential significance. The rain had ceased entirely, leaving the city slicked and gleaming, reflections of streetlights in the wet pavement creating a mosaic of light that seemed to mirror the complexity of the lessons I was absorbing. He moved closer, still maintaining a respectful distance, and I became acutely aware of the rhythm of his movements, the deliberate pacing that conveyed control without overt assertion, each gesture an embodiment of the principles he had been demonstrating. "Do not underestimate the power of observation," he added, eyes locking with mine in a gaze that was at once intense and instructive, "for insight precedes mastery, and mastery is never hurried. You have the capacity to see beyond the surface, to interpret nuance, and to act with measured intent. That is what separates understanding from impulse." I breathed in, slowly, deliberately, internalizing the cadence and weight of his words, feeling the transformation that had begun with a single, unintended message now fully manifesting into a heightened awareness and an acute attentiveness to the world around me. The apartment felt simultaneously larger and smaller, every detail magnified, every shadow and light shifted in meaning, and I realized, with a quiet certainty, that the trajectory of my life had irrevocably changed, that the evening had become a pivot from which nothing would ever feel ordinary again. Richard Blackwood remained poised, a silent anchor in the unfolding morning, and I understood fully that the lessons of presence, perception, and deliberate action would continue to shape each moment. Guiding the path ahead with a subtle yet undeniable force, the memory of the accidental message now a threshold through which my understanding had irrevocably passed.